Good morning. We've all had our morning coffee on the balcony. I'm sorry we had to drag you back in. Maybe we can have class outside later. My name is Preston Bryant, and I have the privilege of serving as chairman of the National Capital Planning Commission. We're delighted that you are with us today to kick off this speaker series and this initiative that we are calling aptly Residents to Presidents. We invited a distinguished panel to participate in a conversation on how this historic Pennsylvania Avenue can continue meeting local and national needs in a 21st century capital city. And I'd like to thank first Rich Bradley and his staff with the Downtown DC Business Improvement District, who is our partner for this discussion, and of course the museum and the Knight Conference Center for providing this extraordinary space to us this morning. I'm also pleased that I have several commissioners, fellow commissioners on the National Capital Planning Commission with me. Bradley Provencia, Beth White, Peter May with the National Park Service are here. So today we formally kick off this new initiative for Pennsylvania Avenue. The National Capital Planning Commission, in partnership with the National Park Service, the General Services Administration, and the District of Columbia, is engaging with local and federal stakeholders what's likely to be a several-year effort. This is not going to be quick. It's going to be in depth, and it's going to take a while. The initiative will identify near-term actions and long-term strategies to improve the operations, the maintenance, and the programming of Pennsylvania Avenue while we develop a more workable governance framework. And we look forward to working with everyone on this ongoing and enduring conversation and partnership. And speaking of the partnership, with us we have Bob Vogel and Peter May from the National Park Service, Mina Wright with the General Services Administration, Ellen McCarthy, David Maloney, and Sam Zimbabwe with the District of Columbia, and others joining us, the architect of the Capitol, folks from the Smithsonian Institution, Charles Piercy with the National Archives, the National Gallery of Art, and the U.S. Commission on Fine Arts, and we have Secretary Tom Lupke with CFA, and two of his commissioners, Phil Freelon and Mia Lehrer, today as well. Pennsylvania Avenue, it goes without saying, is one of the most recognized streets in the nation, if not the world. The events that take place here represent the values of our democratic society, and the avenue reflects the connection and separation of our government's legislative and executive branches. It's important. Pennsylvania Avenue also serves as an important distinctive street for the local folks here in the city who live here, work here, and enjoy the cultural activities. The street we see today reflects an incredible development story. We all know the story from the 1960s of the Pennsylvania Avenue Development Corporation. When it was formed, this area marked the edge of downtown. And it was marked by deteriorating homes and shops and office buildings on the north side and the monumental federal buildings on the south. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan was at the helm, and over several presidential administrations, he supported the avenue's redevelopment, which culminated in Congress establishing the Pennsylvania Avenue Development Corporation in 1972. And again, it was a success story. The PADC leveraged what then was $150 million in public funds into $1.5 billion in private investment, all guided by the PADC plan. This plan used innovative and sometimes risky at the time, something called mixed-use residential development to spark a success, and all of that is, of course, routine urban development today. There are a number of people with ties to the old PADC who are with us today and still continue to be very involved in this ongoing discussion and improvement of the avenue. Today, however, the avenue faces several challenges, and since the PADC was dissolved in 1996, honestly, the avenue has not had a single, that is one organization to be the steward and be responsible for its care. Its amenities and its infrastructure are aging, and they're showing signs of wear and tear. Maintenance funding and appropriate programming are issues, and ensuring a beautiful and well-maintained and cohesive public realm is a continuing priority. so there are challenges. As the city grows and changes, the avenue must be able to compete with other areas of the city to be vibrant and a desirable destination. But it's not all dour, not by any stretch. There are significant opportunities that are going on right now. A handful include the old post office pavilion is being converted into a luxury hotel. We all know that there is the potential redevelopment of the FBI headquarters. There's the pending legislation for a new National World War I memorial at Pershing Park. And then there's the planned refurbishment of several office buildings on the avenue. So individually, each one of these will spark a sustained and positive change, and together there will likely be a catalyst for so much more. And now we need to strategically capitalize on these opportunities to ensure that the avenue fulfills its prominent local and national role in the 21st century. Today is a start. Today is our inaugural meeting to reimagine this inaugural route. And I look forward to continuing this conversation with so many of you over the next several years. So to get on with our panel today, unfortunately one of our panelists, Carol Coletta, was unable to attend, but I'm delighted to introduce the panel's moderator, Zachary Schrag. He is a professor of history at George Mason University and is known to many of you as the author of The Great Subway Society, A History of the Washington Metro. Zach.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and thank you all for coming out today. I have two roles here. First, to moderate the question and answer and discussion later on, but first to take the historian's prerogative of giving you some background stories and maybe setting some of the agenda. So could I have the slides on, please? So you've probably all heard something of the famous origin story. It's January 20th, 1961. The day is very cold. 7.5 inches of snow have fallen the previous night, and the sun is so bright that 86-year-old poet Robert Frost is unable to read the poem he had written specially for the occasion, and he must instead recite The Gift outright from memory. Then the new president, John F. Kennedy, pledges to pay any price, bear any burden, and meet any hardship, and so forth. After this, from the Capitol, Kennedy and his entourage, there they are, drive west on Pennsylvania Avenue, from which the snow has been cleared through a Herculean effort, including the use of flamethrowers. And as Nat Owings later tells the story, both President Kennedy and his Secretary of Labor designate, Arthur Goldberg, look at the two sides of the avenue, the dignified Federal Triangle to the south, and as Owings puts it, they took a good look at the north side of the avenue. They realized that an important part of the L'Enfant plan was in shambles and decided to fix it. Probably Kennedy himself was not paying so much attention to the architecture. Goldberg may well have, but the important point is that it landed on the desk of a young Goldberg assistant named Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And Moynihan was given the task of trying to do something. And in June 1962, he presented his ideas at the end of a report on the otherwise very sexy topic of federal office space, lamenting that the north side of the avenue was characterized by a scene of desolation. The report called for a dramatic transformation in the appearance of Pennsylvania Avenue so that it may assume its rightful place as the principal thoroughfare of the nation's capital. So, taking this advice, Kennedy appointed or perhaps permitted an advisory council on Pennsylvania Avenue, chaired by Owings, who's over with the pointer there, which was followed in the Johnson administration by the temporary president's commission on Pennsylvania Avenue, and as we heard, in the 1970s by the Pennsylvania Avenue Development Corporation, which continued into the 1990s. So if we're thinking about the initial plans of Pennsylvania Avenue, we're talking about really a generational project from the 1960s and into the 1990s. And planners and architects, to use some of Kennedy's terms, they bore the burden of their own long twilight struggle against the common enemies of changing aesthetic standards in a fickle market for commercial real estate. Now the torch has been passed to a new generation of city builders who are unwilling to permit or witness the slow undoing of the work of their predecessors. But I think we need to ask what exactly those earlier Pennsylvania initiatives achieved. What lessons can we take from them? Truth be told, the plans of the 1960s in particular represent the kind of modernist boldness that has long gone out of fashion. Indeed, the 1962 report that got the ball rolling paraphrased Daniel Burnham's famous line, "Make no little plans," in its claim that neither did Washington or L'Enfant make any little plans. And much of the subsequent planning was in that spirit. Plans called for the destruction of most of the old post office and the clearing of the National Theater and Willard Hotel, the last two in the effort to open up a vast so-called National Square east of the Treasury. They also expected to dig more trenches, including along E Street, to separate the automobile from pedestrians, which many people would later say was accommodating the automobile too much. And in retrospect, much of this planning seems more reminiscent of the 1950s era of urban renewal than the 1960s. By 1962, when that first report came out, Jane Jacobs had already published The Death and Life of Great American Cities. Also in 1962, the Roth family had purchased Ghirardelli Square in San Francisco, pioneering a form of renewal based on historic preservation rather than clearance and building of new structures. By the end of the 1960s, many in Washington and around the nation were skeptical of the superblock, of the vast plaza, of the demolition of historic structures. In 1971, plans to demolish the old post office sparked the formation of a group called Don't Tear It Down, which later became the DC Preservation League. And this affected the planners themselves. When the Pennsylvania Avenue Development Corporation in 1974 released its plan, it acknowledged that the increasing unfavorable response, questioning the value of massive government plans in general, and the dangers of sterility and over-monumentality in this plan particularly, had changed the way they were looking at the avenue. As Paul Goldberg of the New York Times noted, the new plans called for a far more modest Pennsylvania Avenue than did the 1960s plan. And it even abandoned such terms as principal thoroughfare or grand axis in favor of the somewhat humbler Main Street. Nor was redevelopment as quick as planners had hoped. In 1977, Goldberger claimed that the newly inaugurated President Carter would see essentially the same Pennsylvania Avenue that greeted President Kennedy 16 years ago, a mixture of grandiose, formal federal structures, run-down 19th century commercial buildings, empty lots, and parking garages. When things were built, they were often to the dismay of critics, most famously the FBI building, probably the least liked building in federal Washington, if not the Mid-Atlantic region. John Woodbridge, the former executive director of PADC, lamented, "We had some of the most eminent architects in America produce some of their most mediocre work." And yet, this humbler vision of the 1970s did a lot of work. It upgraded the avenue's street furniture and lighting, it brought some residents back downtown, and at the very least, the Ronald Reagan building replaced the vast parking lot that had marred the Federal Triangle ever since the 1920s. So, and today, ironically, critics and many Washingtonians are apt to celebrate the failures of the 1960s, particularly the survival of the old post office and the Willard, while mourning the most concrete manifestation of the 1964 plan, the mammoth FBI building sitting on its superblock. And so we get by 2009 the Monumental Core Framework Plan that in one image has the reversal of 1964. The post office shall endure and the FBI building shall vanish. If this all sounds a little negative, let me suggest that it's not quite all that bad. As Chairman Bryant mentioned, we are talking about $1.5 billion of investment in Pennsylvania Avenue and around it. And we can imagine counterfactually what it would have looked like otherwise. In particular, I think without that kind of massive commitment to the avenue, we could have seen more decentralization, more movement to other parts of the district and even out to places like Tyson's Corner, not exactly a planning triumph under many people's visions. Another thing I would mention is while the 1960s plans have this image of being a monolithic urban renewal, it was never quite that bad, at least in intent. Planners did want cafes. They did want pedestrian access, if not pedestrian scale. They did want mixed use. As early as 1962, they were warning against a solid phalanx of office buildings that would be closed on evenings and weekends. They sought an avenue that would be lively, friendly, and inviting, as well as dignified and impressive. And at this point, I would love to show you a slide from 1964 showing their vision of how the avenue would be dignified, impressive, and lively and friendly, and I just couldn't find it because really most of the images from that era are pretty sterile and monumental. But they had the idea at least. And the other thing I would mention is even the boldest reversals of the plan have something to do with big government activism. So without the New Deal's National Historic Sites Act, we would not have had in 1965 the creation of the Pennsylvania Avenue National Historic Site. And likewise, the creation under the Great Society of the National Endowment for the Humanities gave Nancy Hanks her platform to preserve the old post office. So government has a role, even if you're skeptical of big plans. So this leaves me with three basic questions for the morning. First, how bold should initial plans be? Do we want a big vision to start with and then work from there? Second, how do you ensure that plans adapt to the responses? Because I think Pennsylvania Avenue would be much worse if it had not been responsive to the critics the way that the 1974 plan acknowledged. And third, can we go back to clearing snow with flamethrowers? Because that would be really cool. So to answer those questions, we have Gabe Klein and Ellen Ryan. They will introduce themselves briefly and then talk a little bit about their ideas for the Avenue. After that, we'll have a conversation, the three of us, and while that's going on, staff will pass around question and comment cards that will be passed up to me, and I will begin to sort of think about how to synthesize those and put them to our panelists. So let me turn things over to Gabe. You want to flip for it? To Gabe. Okay.
I figure I'm most unprepared. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here, and I have to say I'm sort of honored to be here at NCPC, particularly because I love change. And so it's really great, I think, to have a different point of views on a panel like this. And as I was preparing somewhat for this, I was looking at the history of Pennsylvania Avenue, which is absolutely amazing. I mean, it's so rich. And it's really interesting to note, and I wish I did have some slides, forgive me, but the Pennsylvania Avenue started out as a 6-foot elevated path, which is smaller than the bike lane that we have out there. So it's gone through significant change over the years. And when you really think about it, the last 40 years or so, it's really undergone the least amount of change. When you look at particularly the 1850s, I think it was paved with 3 different type of materials, starting out with chips of stone, wooden blocks, and then finally some version of asphalt as they tried to figure out a way to make Pennsylvania Avenue work for all the different types of vehicles that were coming to the fore. In 1862, you had the first streetcar drawn by a horse, which was competing with the carriages, with the horse and buggy carriages, which were functioning as taxi cabs. And as somebody who works in transportation today, I just find it fascinating that we're going through a lot of the same tensions, and there was a tension there between folks driving those different types of vehicles. We're going through the same tensions now in transportation and all the different modes and all the different options and the technologies, which quickly evolved to the steam-powered streetcar and then the electric-powered streetcar. I believe Pennsylvania Avenue was the first electric-powered streetcar in the country, if I remember correctly. So then, obviously, it became this grand boulevard. And I believe, was it Andrew Jackson who built the Treasury because he wanted to block his view of the Capitol because they just weren't getting along? Sounds familiar. So we've gone through all these incarnations, from federal row houses to beautiful historic buildings, the Raleigh Hotel, the FBI building, that sort of brutalist architecture. But this was a vibrant area. In fact, and I'm not trying to be funny, although it is a little bit funny, there were so many brothels here, and when General Hooker was in charge, that's where the term hooker was actually coined, was right here on Pennsylvania Avenue. So there was a lot going on. It was also known as Murder Bay down here in the south part, which is not necessarily something that people would ascribe to or want to be, but it's the reality. And I guess when I look at Pennsylvania Avenue, I see this beautiful historic place with some blemishes, you know, but without people, it's really a museum. And I just think that we have to be a little bit careful, because we do have beautiful museums down here and beautiful architecture and things that we want to preserve. But we have to be careful making it a museum, a place where you don't have a lot of activity. And so, you know, when we lost the streetcar in 1962, it was here for exactly 100 years, I think we lost some of that connection between the people of Washington that, you know, live, work, and play in D.C., and the federal government and the seat of the federal government. And really, we want to tie those together. They're both really important. Also, you know, at the time, we had a population north of 800,000, I think approaching 900,000. And so I think the federal government was appropriate. I mean, it was appropriate for them to really step in and take a much bigger role, particularly when our local government was in tatters and physically the city was in tatters. But now that we're on the upswing and we have, I think, 1,300 people coming into the district every month, and I think it was Rich Bradley who told me that actually a good portion of that, north of 50%, are babies. So when you look at those figures of who's coming to the district, it's actually a lot of people being born here. I left for Chicago in April 2011 to work there for the mayor, and when I came back, I couldn't believe the difference. And sometimes when you leave a place and come back to that place, you see those stark differences. And seeing the strollers everywhere was just unbelievable. And then quickly, of course, I had to jump on the bandwagon and have a baby myself. Although my wife always corrects me and says, no, I had the baby. So DC's on the upswing. And, you know, when I was working on the streetcar, and Marcel and I are good friends, but we would sort of bump heads on, you know, what's the role of the federal government here and the local government. And it's a tough question. But I do think, I think the city will be better if we have a partnership between local and federal, and we really celebrate the local sort of involvement. You know, when I talk to people, when I travel and talk about D.C., a lot of people have a negative view of D.C. right now, obviously. And they think of just the federal government. They think of the House and the Capitol. And when I explain, there's this whole other side of D.C. There's all these local people. Some people are third, fourth generation. There's a whole world there that people aren't aware of, and they're sort of like blown away by it. They're like, really? I'm like, yeah, you should visit U Street and, you know, other parts of the city. And it gives them a different view, and they want to come here and check that out. And let's be honest, the federal government's not as bad as everybody thinks. Well, maybe. But I think our culture is just much richer when we merge those two and celebrate them, particularly because the folks at the federal level churn every few years. And the rest of us are here for a very long time. So that consistency is important. So I do like change. I embrace change, but I also recognize that we want to preserve things. I'm excited about the new hotel coming. I also don't want to see a giant Trump sign on it. Hopefully that's not going to happen. I'm counting on you, NCPC. And then I'll just close by just saying that, you know, like when I'm working in Charleston, South Carolina right now, and obviously Charleston is a very historic place. You know, beautiful homes, you know, Georgian mansions, 1750s homes. And when I'm working with the preservation folks there, and the question I keep asking them is, what do you want to preserve and for who? And are you preserving this to look like the 1750s, or do you want to preserve it like the 1950s? And when I'm there, I see these beautiful homes, and I see Ford F-350 diesel pickups parked out front. And just, you know, something doesn't quite fit. So I do think we need to figure out, like, we need to step out of our skin a little bit and figure out, from a modal standpoint, how much space we want to give to each mode. I do think that the bike lanes were a big step forward and back, meaning that we took that space that the streetcar had, we gave it back to people, and we connected the city a little bit more and made it more about the local people and the federal government, and they both, you know, both groups use it tremendously. So with that, I will be quiet, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. First, I just wanted to give an emphatic yes to the flamethrowers. I want to go right on record for that. So my name is Ellen Ryan. I'm a urban planner by training, and right now work for the Trust for Public Land, which is a fantastic organization. The last time, and I wanted to thank the staff and the commissioners for inviting me here. This is a real honor to be here. So the last time I lived in Washington, D.C., I think Marion Barry was mayor. There was no such thing as the Nationals. Union Station was under reconstruction and was just a series of tunnels at that point. There was no such thing as Penn Quarter. So it's remarkable how much the city has changed and grown and continued its vibrancy. It's really extraordinary, and I feel lucky that I have that vantage point to see it. So Pennsylvania Avenue, it's not just any street, it's America's Avenue. And when you're freighted with that kind of symbolism and long lineage of historic figures that have sought to make the avenue reflect the ideals of the American nation, it's the site of celebrations and national mourning, parades and protests, festivals and fundraisers, and yet in those long periods between those events, it's really quiet. So there have been many plans in the past, but there's so many new considerations to factor in now. Terrorism, green infrastructure, climate change, dark sky concerns, technologies now, green building, wayfinding. So any plan must, honor its extraordinary lineage, but it has a whole new array of issues to take into account. But there are so many great assets that Pennsylvania Avenue has, and being here last night and having the opportunity to have dinner outside on a gorgeous evening, you see it so clearly. In the field of landscape architecture, landscape architects often talk about borrowed landscape. It's those elements in the city that add to the particular place that you're thinking about. So when I lived in New York, I worked at Brooklyn Bridge Park for a time, which is a new park on the Brooklyn side of the East River. And so the borrowed elements there were not so shabby, the Brooklyn Bridge, Statue of Liberty, and the iconic skyline of Lower Manhattan. So here on Pennsylvania Avenue, you have the extraordinary, iconic neoclassical buildings, the Capitol, the White House. That's an extraordinary thing to build off of. You have low crime. You have no loading docks. You have lots of street width to work with. You have great public transit access. You have a strong identity and strong streetwell character. So all those things are, we can't take those for granted. That really gives you a leg up on that. But what might seem as an extra challenge, sort of this burden, this freighting of it being America Street, is really a singular opportunity, and you have to find ways to leverage that historic stature and that international spotlight to create an inviting, vital, and attractive promenade. So 1.5 miles, it needs to represent more than the physical and philosophical gap between the executive and legislative branches of government. In my view, Pennsylvania Avenue has sort of been a mannequin for every decade's design and planning fashion trend. It's been subjected to sort of policy call and response. So when there's the use of heavy-handed eminent domain, that begets the rise of a historic preservation ethic that's held through with the post office. And then a period of modernist design is followed by postmodern rejoinder. And I will also argue that, for the most part, the consideration of Pennsylvania Avenue has been undertaken by a closed system of insiders, and it's time to change that. So don't get me wrong, those closed system of insiders has been some of the most extraordinary political and design minds in the country. Daniel Moynihan, one of my personal heroes, Nathaniel Owings. I used to work at Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. I have great respect. Landscape architect Dan Kiley. These are truly some of the best. But even all-star committees, even after their time has come, the avenue now starts to feel a little stale. And we were talking about this last night at dinner. As the rest of the city really comes into high definition, that Pennsylvania Avenue is still a little bit of a blur. And so it's time to remedy that. So there's two key opportunities on the horizon that the other speakers and the chairman referred to. The first is represented by the FBI's impending relocation to outside the city, and the prospect of that privately regenerated use of the 6.7-acre site. So one of the nation's most hated buildings, that's a quote I came across as I looked at that. The other, of course, is the adaptive reuse of the old post office, and that's also extraordinary. So together, these have the potential to add a whole new level of street activity to Pennsylvania Avenue, and that's why it's so important that we lead with the public vision before these sites are complete. So one of the things I've learned from the Trust for Public Land is that the best way to activate a public space is to ask the people who are going to use it what they want. So one recommendation I have is to launch an open ideas competition. And this could be maybe in partnership with the National Building Museum or some of the other partners nearby. The power of these exercises is that they sort of unshackle our mindsets a bit, and they're beginning of a philosophical public investment. They don't have to be binding, but they do send a strong signal that the public is welcome, and the recognition that this is the people street rather than an outdoor governmental corridor. So if this is America's Avenue, it may seem difficult to find a proxy for the entire nation. There have been a few previous efforts that are worth mentioning, and I realize I should go to slides. So this is actually just a street of a program called Summer Streets in New York that Jeanette Sadat Khan, one of Gabe's friends and colleagues, instituted in New York. And it's one of my favorite examples of a way to activate a street. It's a very curated series of programs in the summer that turns the street over to public use with art, with exercise, with all sorts of athletic events, and it's just been a real success. But in terms of capturing public imagination, I can think of two things in the last few decades. One is the Statue of Liberty effort, and what Lee Iacocca and the foundation did to renovate the Statue of Liberty, in which they really got donations of $1, letters from children, but it really had a way of capturing people's imagination about protecting a national asset. Another is the See America campaign. This is a collaboration between the Creative Action Network, an arts organization, and the National Parks Conservation Association. And so they're sort of crowdsourcing new posters for national parks. And what a great way to get interest going in an artistic way for one of our national assets. So lots of programming, from what I understand, happens on Pennsylvania Avenue, but a lot of it is more of an escape valve for programs that can't happen on the mall. There's a sense that, you know, there's a street fair going on, but it's not really tied to what's happening, what the identity of the street is. So I would argue that you really need to curate a new series of program that takes its cue from the extraordinary things that happen on the avenue. Could you host outdoor naturalization ceremonies to welcome America's newest citizens? Can you find ways to communicate what's happening inside the legislative process in those buildings and make those votes maybe visible in the public realm, turning the buildings inside out? I see that the Patent Office is no longer in Washington, D.C. I think they're outside, but how fun it would be to have a installation of patent drawings, so that the avenue becomes about ideas, and that's sort of America's greatest contribution is a nation of ideas. So I wanted to look at some of the success of other famous avenues and see if there's anything that's worthwhile. In Paris, the Champs-Élysées is about 1.25 miles, so it's a little bit of an analog there. It hosts national events like Pennsylvania Avenue, and it's used lighting and plantings to revive the grandeur of this corridor. Lighting won't interrupt activities. That's kind of why I'm a big fan of it. And if it's done correctly, it can address those dark sky concerns and keep the Capitol the focal point at night. In London, at the Kensington Gardens, the Serpentine Gallery has its pavilion every summer and sort of adds a fresh attraction to the Kensington Gardens every year and invites some of the best architectural talent across the world to interpret the space again for them. So maybe this isn't the right scale, but it would be nice to think of some of the opportunities for that event. On Park Avenue in New York, you have the Park Avenue Mall. There's a seasonal exhibition of sculpture that happens every summer. This is a project that's really done by a private organization, a sort of a Friends of group, but it really unites the avenue in the summer. It's an event that everyone looks forward to, and it uses the power of art to give a new identity and new life to the street. And it seems like that's something that's really not been tried at Pennsylvania Avenue. And I think with this remarkable reinvestment in Washington, D.C., it's time to try to give this a try. And you can do it in a temporary fashion that doesn't necessarily have to cost a lot of money. It can be, an experiment, and it can go away. So that's the best thing about these temporary exhibitions. And finally, in Belgium, you have an annual flower carpet. This is the main square of Brussels. It sort of shifts the scale of the space, is a huge attraction, and it's short-lived. It doesn't have to stay forever. Actually, this is my final slide. So in my new hometown, Philadelphia, city planners are really grappling with what to do with Benjamin Franklin Parkway. It's quite beautiful. It's punctuated by the Philadelphia Museum of Art and the very ornate City Hall. And this is Eakins Oval, which has been sort of the last of, I'm going to borrow a phrase of Beth's, one of the charms in the bracelet that sort of exasperated people in terms of what to do with it. So they've tried a summer installation for 2 years now, and I think I'm not going to suggest that the artist candy-coated come to Pennsylvania Avenue, but it was a fun experiment, and I think they're learning each summer as they think about a more permanent solution. And one other example in Philadelphia is the Amtrak station there, 30th Street. For the last few decades, the space around it has just been horrendous, unwelcoming, confusing, no place to put bikes, no place to get something to eat. The local business improvement district there created something called the Porch. They program it, they have some mini golf, they have food trucks on a regular basis, they have concerts, small-scale concerts. But what they're doing is not just sort of the standard pop-up thing. They're studying it really closely to understand the usage patterns and to see how it might inform a more permanent intervention. But it's made such a huge difference. The 30th Street station is one of the main gateways to Philadelphia, and it's all the better for it. So I think undertaking one of these efforts is really about partnerships, and certainly there's a business improvement district, there's a committee of 100, there's all the federal agencies, the local Department of City Planning, Cultural Affairs. All these need to come together, but you need a leader, and I think that's what we talked about earlier was missing the PADC as sort of a leader for that. So I think it really needs to have that momentum and someone who's paying attention to do the curating, to work out understandings with the new property owners and help guide those private sites. So in closing, I just want to thank you all for being here, and I look forward to the questions. Thanks.
Thank you both. On now? Great. Well, thank you both for those remarks. I'm going to make you fight in a moment, but first, as a transportation person myself, I'd like to think about the fact that first and foremost, we're talking about a street. And at some level, we expect streets to move people and vehicles and goods. And I wonder, particularly Gabe, but if Ellen, you want to chime in, what are sort of the core functions of transportation that we want to see on the avenue? How are they changing, not just with bike lanes, though I know there's a lot of interest in that, but where does this fit into the transportation system of the city and really of the region?
Yeah, and I realized when I went up there and gave my spiel, I didn't really say who I was, which is the core thing I was supposed to do. So I am currently the chief operating officer at a startup called Bridge, which is important to this conversation. It's a sort of next generation big data company that deploys mass transit, pop-up mass transit, basically. So think of the taxi meets the bus, smart routing of smaller form vehicles that can carry, let's say, 13 to 20 people. Before that, I was the commissioner of the Department of Transportation in Chicago, and then before that, here in DC, and then at Zipcar and various other things, so public and private. So to answer your question, or to try to chime in on that, I mean, we do want to move people, and I think because most of us are somewhere between 20 and 70 or 80, we sort of take for granted that the automobile is the de facto mode of choice. But we've been on this earth for hundreds of thousands of years, and it's only been about 50 or 60 since the car has been king. And with the population heading, north of 9 billion by 2050 versus 2 billion in 1900, the car, whether it's Uber or taxi, you can only carry so many people in cars, and they're dangerous as well. We lose 1.24 million people a year worldwide to car accidents, which is it's the leading killer of people 10 to 19 years old. And the reason I say that is that there's so much technology that's coming down the road. So when you ask that question about what should we do with Pennsylvania Avenue, you also have to take into consideration that there's this exponential change in technology, particularly in the transportation space, but everywhere. And so will cars be driving themselves in 10 years? Yes, probably so. How does that affect the amount of space that we need for vehicles? Dramatically. You may need half the space. Will you need parking garages? Probably not. Cars sit 95% of the time, 94.8% of the time to be precise. And the estimates when I was out at Google X from their folks, their policy people, is that cars will be active 95% of the time, which means that they will be constantly roving, picking people up and dropping them off. So you won't need parking. So on Pennsylvania Avenue, maybe it's not quite as important, but for the off-street parking, it's important. So Jeff Speck, who's a great advocate for walking and biking and active transportation, has written a book recently about it. Tells people if you're building a parking garage, just make sure that you're building it with the ramps in the middle so you can convert it to office space in 10 years. And it's true. So anyway, those are more questions than answers, but I think it's important to recognize how much things are changing, and you need modularity and flexibility in everything that you do. So if you're going to say, well, we need more space for cars right now, recognize that it may be a bus in 5 years and it may be a sidewalk in 10 years, and how do you sort of design for that? I just want to chime in on Ellen's point too about temporary installations. You may think, well, we can't do temporary stuff on Pennsylvania Avenue. It's America's main street. But look at what Jeanette did in New York with Times Square. That was just a pilot. The whole thing was a pilot with basically paint, some aggregate, and some tables and chairs. And that is the busiest, core of a city in probably the entire world, outside of maybe London, or Tokyo, actually. So yes, we can do grand experiments, and that's how you can learn. People are very visual. They need to see. If you can actually paint something on the street and show people how it would work, you might get more buy-in for it.
Okay. So I see at least 2 points of tension between your perspectives. The first one is the concept of the museum. So Gabe, you specifically used that as a somewhat derogatory term, without people at the museum. And Ellen, you seem to like the idea of Pennsylvania Avenue as a museum. And you use the metaphor of curation. And I wonder, that's sort of the opposite from the transportation network, or maybe not. But is that a good metaphor? What are the perils? I mean, if Gabe, if you want to sort of think about what's good about that museum metaphor, Ellen, maybe some of the perils to make you argue against yourselves. The idea of the city, I mean, we hear this about Venice, for example. Oh, Venice, it used to be a city, now it's a museum, right? That's long been a fear in Washington as well, that it could turn into something frozen. And yet, museums are wonderful places. So what do we do with that metaphor when we're thinking about vision?
Yeah, I think of it as less a museum and more as a cultural corridor. And one of the phrases I use at the Trust for Public Land is there's more than one way to skin the cultural cat. You can do it in incredible interactive ways. And so to have all those museums that are nearby that are free, I mean, to think that this is not an elitist, this is not the, the MoMA or where it's $20, $25 to get in, but these are free institutions and so close by. If you could just persuade them to open one night, maybe in the summer, a Thursday night late, so to help out the restaurants, to get people out on their bikes and seeing something. If you could get the National Theater to maybe program a series in Freedom Plaza, once a month, or I think of Lincoln Center in New York, which has done so much to sort of break out of its Citadel 1960s, enclosed campus, to have this Lincoln Center out of doors, which has been such a success. People learn how to swing dance and salsa. It's an extraordinary thing. So I think there's ways to be populist in culture that can really activate the space. Think about all the ethnic dance that make up, the American people. There could be extraordinary festivals just based on that. So I think there are assets that can be used here that would be really incredible with low investment.
I'll just add that I don't disagree with anything that she said. And I didn't mean to be derogatory towards museums. I love museums. But I think museums are often static for long periods of time, and they have a certain installation for long periods. And my favorite museum that I've ever been to is the Children's Museum in Boston. And it's because it's so activity-based. There's so many activities, and it's built for kids. And I also believe that people are just big kids. We try to be serious all the time, but there's no reason that Pennsylvania Avenue, I'm awestruck. Even though I've lived here for 20 years, just this morning walking down Pennsylvania Avenue, I'm continually awestruck just by the view and just the entire thing that it is and what it represents and how massive it is and the long blocks and all of that stuff. But I think you can be awestruck and you can preserve that beauty and also make it really active and busy and bustling and have sidewalk cafes and make it a place that kids love to be and make it fun. And so again, not to harp on the bike lanes, but I love that there's sort of this whimsical fun aspect to it too, and that you sort of see people having fun on their commute to work versus being stuck in traffic and angry, or being really angry if you're a taxi cab driver, or the buses that idle over there and spew smoke. So I just think that we don't want it to be a museum with a lack of activity, I guess. We want it to be a busy, bustling, fun place.
A children's museum
On the
is an
street.
interesting, that's a more refined metaphor than a museum, a place where you press buttons and things break and you try and costume, so forth. Let me add that we should be circulating comment and question cards. So if people have questions for the panel or angry comments or whatever, fill out a card. We'll collect those in a little bit, but you have some time while we're talking. It strikes me, this is not so much a tension between the two of you, but a question you both raised, which is the question of scale. Pennsylvania Avenue, I think, is wider than 6 feet at this point. And a lot of the critiques that both of the things that were planned, such as National Square, which was going to be 600 by 800 feet, and even what was built, Freedom Plaza, the wide sidewalks, the many lanes of highway, a lot of people over the last decades have suggested that the scale is just off. And I was interested to see some of Ellen's slides where a lot of those were sort of narrowing the avenues in various ways. You put down flowers, you put up banners, you put in bike lanes. I wonder if you would both sort of care to comment on whether the avenue is just a little too big and the sidewalk's a little too big, and whether one of the parts of the vision may be to try to restore a more human scale to it.
I think it's absolutely worth considering. I mean, I guess the term of art these days is road diet, and certainly I come from a street grid in New York and Philadelphia now that's far more narrow, with the exception of Benjamin Franklin Parkway. But I think it's worth trying, and if we can build parks where we use them as fountains in the summer and ice skating rinks in the winter, then there's got to be a way to make it adaptable so that you can have the inaugural parade and have the pomp and circumstance when you need to. but that you can scale it in when it's not needed. I was struck this morning that the traffic just didn't look that busy to me. You know, the traffic going on the other corridor seemed much more busy. So it just seemed like there was an incredible opportunity there to get that back. Yeah.
Yes, I think. Well, you know, I love the width, and you know, I love when you're like riding your bike down the middle, or you're in your car, and you just have this incredible line of sight from one end to the other because of its width. I think you can maintain that, but I think the problem with really wide streets, particularly when you devote most of the lanes to cars, is it feels like a highway, and a highway has a lot of problems because cars go too fast. It's not a healthy place for pedestrians, and you obviously have a lot of pedestrians down here. You know, so speed is really a big issue, but also you have a dividing line often between the city and sort of seat of the federal government in this case. In other places you have divisions between neighborhoods. I live in Columbia Heights, north of here, and we did a streetscape on Sherman Avenue, and we put a beautiful planted median. Well, I don't know if it's beautiful, but it's a pretty nice planted median down the middle with irrigation, and that was a important piece of linking together the Howard University neighborhood and the Columbia Heights neighborhood. And now people traverse, I mean, it's anecdotal, but much more than they used to. And so when you look at the plans for Pennsylvania Avenue in was it maybe early 1800s, before the streetcar went in, the plan was for it to be a beautiful park in the middle, you know, with old trees, I mean, at some point, and, you know, people sitting there on park benches. And so that didn't happen, and the streetcar went in. But maybe, you know, in my experience, you just usually need to go back to the plans from 100 years ago. So maybe we just need to look at that plan. Again, to your point, we don't have a lot of traffic. I don't know what the average daily traffic is right now on Pennsylvania Avenue, but it's not much. And so is there an opportunity at some point, particularly with technology changing, to put a park in the middle and maintain bike lanes? Probably. Probably.
And what about actually even the sidewalks and the plazas? Because those are potentially overscaled too. Do we need a sidewalk diet to go with our road diet? Or do we want to, how would you think about
I
this?
wouldn't be willing to go that far. I think what they need is some amenities on those sidewalks. As we took a walk last night, you know, we saw sidewalks that, I don't know, 40 feet wide. I mean, in some cases, you know, and then it feels very narrow as you get to Freedom Plaza, and the lighting sort of disappears there. But I would argue that it's really about programming that space and thinking about some retail, restaurant use. It's just begging for some place to get a cup of coffee, to have a seat. That can be done so cheaply and so successfully, I think. Yeah.
I mean, it should be much more mixed use. You should have ground floor retail. Every restaurant should have outdoor seating. Sorry if I'm being opinionated, but I mean, it's sort of obvious. And then, you know, K Street has the same problem. So when we were redesigning K Street, the idea was to maintain or widen the sidewalks, but program them, get ground floor retail and restaurants in there, have the streetcar running down the middle, a lot of activity.
One thing that struck me about Ellen's comments, which she said it would be really nice to ask the people what they want, and then you point out that it's not too clear who the people are. There are the people who are living here now who may go off to Chicago on a moment's notice. There are the people who are in Chicago now who don't know that they're going to be here in 10 years. The people who are planning to visit and do, you know, expect to have a certain claim on this national space, but how much really do we want someone, you know, from the Mountain West to be telling people what kind of cafes should exist in the center of DC. So certainly this was a conflict in the 60s and 70s as Home Rule came in. Gabe, you seem to suggest that some of that's been resolved, but we just this week had another statehood hearing, which suggests to me that this is a problem that won't be resolved for a while. How do we think about, you know, I think it's obvious that the people of DC should have a very strong voice. What kind of voice should we give to people in the suburbs and people in the nation overall?
Well, I think one way you can start certainly is by doing sort of quick surveys of people who are on the avenue now. So take it like a day like today and draw up a quick survey and ask some questions. to see, what brings them here. Is it work? Is it, a particular museum? Is it a restaurant that they like? Is it trying to find a place to grab lunch at a picnic table? And then if you did a design competition, you could also sort of have a public voting for different ideas, and that might be a way to capture some feedback on what really resonates with people, why they would come here, what would convince them to walk the entire length if that's what you want, or to move here. And so I think the FBI site is so exciting because that can really bring residents. I was struck last night that we must have sat at dinner for 2 hours. I didn't see a single dog. And I just thought that was really interesting, that most streets you see, eventually you'll see somebody walking their dog, not one. And there's people there, but it speaks to a lack of residences, and that could really change dramatically as Penn Quarter continues to grow and that site becomes available. So it will change, and you're never done planning for a street like this, but there are ways, I think, to capture public input even in those short ways.
We're getting a lot of great questions and comments here, so maybe I'll turn some of these over. One that I should have thought about, but is quite interesting, is someone brings up the south side of the avenue, Federal Triangle, which is obviously architecturally impressive, but for the last 90 years or so, people have realized has been a kind of dead spot, a big wall between federal Washington and local Washington, kills the city at night. All those people leave. It used to be that big parking lot. At least that's gone, but it's still a problem. Is there a way we can think about the south side of the avenue that might achieve some of the goals that you've set out?
Question.
I don't know
Thanks,
if I have
Gabe.
an answer to that. I sort of ignore the south side. I mean, I don't know what can be done. What's in our power? What can really be changed?
Yeah, that is a tricky one. I know there's some ideas that came out about lighting the buildings at night, using the facades as sort
That's
of
a great
protecting-
idea.
It's not mine, but I
Lighting the buildings at night is a very good one, I think.
Yeah, I don't know if there's tours that could sort of help to demystify what's happening inside those buildings, both from an external part, sort of a self-guided tour, to make them a little less mysterious. It's a good question. I don't have a quick answer for that.
Yeah, what was the question before that? Maybe I can answer that.
Well, actually, here's what, so people seem to be, I'm certainly taken, but others as well, with this idea of the temporary. If you think about what you were saying about the shared vehicles, right? You're going to get in a pod car and it will drive you, and then you leave it, or the pop-up installations. That I wonder if that is sort of the big 21st century vision, that rather than build a monument for the ages, we're going to have a kind of modularity and temporary nature to these things, and it is going to be more experiential than fixed in granite forever. And yeah, I don't know if that works for Federal Triangle itself, whether you could have a temporary thing that would be bring people in, but maybe. But I wonder, I sort of asked at the beginning, what do we think about the make no little plans? And maybe if you have enough little plans and modules and they're temporary, they do actually add up to a big plan. So
Yeah. Well, you could do both.
yeah.
In Chicago, for instance, we had this program called the Make Way for People program, and anybody can Google Make Way for People Chicago, and you can see it. And the idea was to partner with the private sector, the business improvement districts, we call them SSAs there, and to activate space that was either underutilized or was utilized, let's say, by cars and could be something more interesting for the community. So we had, alleys, parking spaces, plazas, and something else. And some of this stuff was done for as little as $1,000. Sometimes they'd spend up to $70,000. It was completely modular. You break them down out of season, put them in storage, bring them back out. I think there's much more of sort of a software approach to urban planning right now versus a hardware approach. And what I mean by that, like I'm working with a 24-year-old right now, and younger people have a much more iterative approach to things. Like, let's try it, see what happens. If it doesn't work, we'll do something else. Now, you can't do that with the Bloomingdale Trail, which Beth White and I worked on in Chicago, or the Riverwalk, where, you know, in a matter of months, or a couple of years, we went from conceiving a project to really going to construction on a $100 million project. But you can sort of crowdsource or get public input. And I think there's some combination here where you can do some temporary installations, start to loosen up the code a little bit and allow more outdoor seating and pop-ups and things of that nature. And I think it'll stimulate the ideas for what the long-term plan might be.
Well put. I agree.
On a related note, some people are asking about who might be responsible for those kinds of pop-ups. There's one card, well, what if each state had some space that they were responsible for, which, you know, at some level I think was in the state, you know, I mean, it is Pennsylvania Avenue after all, that you know, there were some ideas in the 1790s that states might take responsibility for parts of the city. There's another card about the Canadian Embassy, you know, could they be responsible for more things? I'm thinking about the archives across the way, which has done certainly things on the Constitution Avenue side. I'm not sure if they've done much on the Pennsylvania Avenue side. This might not just be a question of permitting such things, but also nudging or coercing or somehow getting these great institutions that we have, even without the patent office. We've got a lot of interesting things that could potentially be brought out onto the street.
You could have a bunch of guys on typewriters out in the parking space.
Well, you know, the Federal Trade Commission, you know, does interesting stuff. You could have, I don't know, defective and deceptive products you know, lined up for people to try.
But absolutely, like in that example I was giving, you know, the local businesses and the local SSAs, I mean, they're the ones that thought of everything. Our job was to have central sort of guidance and standards and then help get them through the red tape. So, you know, whether it's the National Park Service or the Downtown Business Improvement District here as a central coordinating, you know, partnership, let's say, but then you could have all of the Canadians here are super creative. I mean, they've done some amazing programming. So, yeah, why not have them come up with an idea for a parklet or pop-up?
I mean, you use the software metaphor. You've got platforms like Blogger and WordPress that give you a framework, and then you plug in your content, and there it is. I wonder if there's some kind of planning, you know, where there would be a kind of module where, you know, here's how we think you should budget, here's how much space, here's some things, but it's up to you to provide the central content, whatever your
That would be a
institution
terrific
does.
idea. You know, I love the idea of some of the, you know, the actors who are tenants or, you know, players in the immediate neighborhood, or the states themselves, maybe working with a curator or an artist to bring some fresh ideas, you know, every summer, every spring. So you have different activation of ideas around the corridor. I think
Public
that would
art.
be- Yeah.
There's some great public art stuff, which in Chicago they do really well, by the way.
An audience member mentions that the museum itself is actually something of a leader with a very you know, active front, showing people the news and really telling people what's going on inside the building and
that
also
sets a
enlivening
great
the avenue. So
Yeah.
maybe just turn it over to those folks and have them.
Why not?
Yeah.
Maybe you should be the executive director, whatever this is, and you could run it.
Right.
Those are great ideas, though.
I just want, so one of the questions that comes up, which is actually something I was thinking about as well, is we are, you know, hopefully tearing down the FBI building, which was one of the major creations of the 60s and 70s. And except for some very tongue-in-cheek comments, I don't expect a big preservationist crowd to show up to protest that. But there is this question of the preservation of modernism, you know, 50 years on. I'm certainly concerned about potential changes to Metro's architecture. On the other hand, you know, Moynihan and the others understood that the avenue should never be finished, that it was good to have texture, it was good to have rethinking. So beyond FBI, are there other parts that really could use a bulldozer or at least major redesign? One of the audience members would love to see Freedom Plaza go. Or conversely, are there some elements of the 1960s that you'd really love to see and, you know, preserved until 2160 or 2560 or something like that?
I'm going to make no one happy by saying I'll be
loyal to Venturi Scott Brown and say I think Freedom Plaza does have a role, and I think not only for its design, but also just because it's a very neutral space. All sorts of activities can happen there. Last night we saw skateboarders, which was great. It was great to see some activity, frankly. I know they can do some damage, but I know people are shaking their heads right now. But it brought some life and some fun to the avenue. So I think that space is actually not a problem. I think it should be taken care of, and I think it can be a great venue and setting and platform for terrific programming of all kinds. On the other hand, again, I'm not going to make any friends here. The Friedberg space, the Pershing Square, to me looks dated. It's the depression of that public space. I'm a follower of Holly White, and I think it really needs some rethinking to bring it up to grade, to activate it, and make it a more compelling place to be. So that's how I would treat it.
I'll just say that, yeah, I mean, the FBI building could really transform this entire area down here, and I think that, why shouldn't it have a grocery store in the bottom of it, with Penn Quarter sort of exploding in growth and more density in Chinatown. In terms of the other buildings, I'm not an expert, nor do I sort of know all the blocks, but I was walking down here and there's like district offices in the next building up, and I just think we need to have more ground floor activation. And I don't know that you need to sort of detonate a bomb in these buildings, or if you can just re-acclimate them, but I think there's a huge opportunity for that. And with the 40-foot sidewalks, you're not going to have a lot of activity if you have an office building for the government.
And I think there are some new zoning techniques where you can get rid of that ATM lobby that spans for 60 feet, or the CVS. It's as we walked by last night, it was lit up. There was that, but I think there are ways in the zoning code that you can actually address that so that you have more variety of.
But the big opportunity is the street itself. Like, it's going to take a long time to filter buildings in and out, and the FBI building is right now facing us. But I think the street can be redesigned relatively quickly. We pave it every 4 years. We put bike lanes in a week or two. There's a lot that can be done quickly and make it feel differently without sort of upsetting whatever balance there is with the buildings.
And what about the Trump Hotel? Because I've got to say, from a sort of naive point of view, it's not like it's the first hotel on the avenue. I understand that people are excited about it, but are you as excited about it? I mean, it's not residence, it's not a grocery store, it's not a transformative addition to the avenue the way that we could imagine some other things being. But are there other places where a hotel like that has really made a difference?
Well, I think for Pennsylvania Avenue, it really will make a difference because it's going to get out of that 9 to 5 mold that it's been in for the last few decades. And I think, with historic preservation regulations in mind, that there won't be a big Trump sign, hopefully, but that the building would be lit at night. You see the beautiful tower, that it's an attraction. Maybe, bike share will have a thing there so that tourists can get around that way. So I think it'll have more than value because of its prominent placement on the avenue.
And it's a huge structure. So I was watching Trump's daughter, who's on TV, who's actually sort of responsible for the project, and she was talking about all the amenities that will be in there, and there are going to be restaurants, and so I think, I'm somewhat excited about having a hotel down here because of everything you outlined. I'm more excited to see what else they put in to sort of fill it out. Could have 3 or 4 restaurants, for instance.
Here's a question that turns things around a little bit, is other avenues in DC, and there are other ones, Connecticut Avenue in particular, has done a lot of things we're talking about with a lot of residential, depending where you are, a lot of mixed use, street restaurants. If we have other places in the district that are doing some of these functions, that are attractive spaces, lively spaces, is there a special role for Pennsylvania Avenue to be a little bit more sedate, monumental, grand, all of those old words that maybe were taken a little too far in the 1960s, but did recognize a distinctiveness about Pennsylvania Avenue that perhaps should be treasured.
Well, I think to me, it's not about competition. I think all of those uses are great. I think what's needed at Pennsylvania Avenue is a little bit more curation, because again, I get the sense it's sort of an escape valve for events that can't happen on the mall. And so you get a lot of charity events that are great for the charities and the participants, but don't really add to the bottom line of Pennsylvania Avenue, don't bring anything particularly, special. So I think it's time for some curation events that really speak to that character, speak to the gravitas of where this is and its fundamental role for the country. So I think some thinking about that identity, some reflection will be really important to make that shift in programming.
Yeah, and curation in terms of tenants, because do we need another bank or another CVS on Pennsylvania Avenue? We also probably don't want a Bubba Gump's Shrimp Company. We don't want it to be Navy Pier, right, Beth? So you need to be careful, and I think Logan Circle is a great example of a community that's really transformed over the last decade, that has some of the best of the old in terms of architecture and a lot of new, and feels like a local place, but a really active place. It's not, I'm not trying to compare it to Pennsylvania Avenue. I would look at Columbia Heights and say, it's been a huge success in terms of TOD, but then I think, you do have a bit of the Bubba Gump's Shrimp Company effect there, and there's a TGI Fridays opening up, and, we don't want Pennsylvania Avenue to be that necessarily. So curation, I think, is the key on a lot of different levels. But I think that it can be grand and beautiful and be active. And I was in Paris recently, and you see examples all over Paris. And near the Champs-Élysées, I was trying to confirm this with somebody, there's like a Ferris wheel and an amusement park. I mean, they do some pretty interesting stuff, and they have their event once a year where they close it and make it a park. They've put a beach nearby. I mean, I think we need to think outside of the box a little bit.
In Philadelphia, there's actually a beer garden on Independence Mall right now. So there's an example of some interesting use at a federal installation, really, that's been very popular and it diversifies the folks who go to that quadrant of Philadelphia.
And we have no problem doing weekend events on Pennsylvania Avenue. I mean, every summer, every weekend, it's shut down, right? You can't get through, and it's a pain unless you want to go to the chili cook-off sponsored by Safeway. So we're used to doing big events, but humans tend to get into this pattern of that's what we do on Pennsylvania Avenue. We do this during the week, we do this on the weekends. And I do think getting the public's input and people from other places, I never really got to comment on that. Why not have people from North Dakota comment on what they'd like to see on Pennsylvania Avenue? It doesn't mean you give them the same weight as the people maybe that live in the city, but they may have some great ideas.
We've had a couple of questions about security. You mentioned not wanting to set off a bomb, and I spent last weekend at Fort McHenry in this hyper-secure environment. You couldn't bring in a water bottle, you couldn't bring in a backpack, and I wonder, we lost, post-Oklahoma City, we lost the access to the White House to vehicles. Now it seems after the Boston Marathon bombing, it's, backpacks are sort of the next to go. And do either of you have any thoughts on how, each incremental threat is going to interfere with what we'd like to see on Pennsylvania Avenue?
I can answer a little bit if you want.
Sure. No, my experience to some degree is framed by Wall Street and after 9/11, how the streetscapes of Lower Manhattan changed, and it's eased up a little bit. I think it changes over time, but I think the streets of Lower Manhattan are still quite vital, even right in front of the New York Stock Exchange. They're even with the World Trade Center site, they've reopened Greenwich Street. So it's not perfect, but they've found ways to open up the memorial. So I think there's ways of hardening the streetscape without cutting off public access and making people feel like they're being watched. So I'm heartened that in New York, just, as we stare down the 13th anniversary of the, that so much has changed in Lower Manhattan, and it feels really a vital place and more 24-hour than it ever has been. So.
Yeah, I'd just add that I think the soft side is more important than the hard side. I remember when we were preparing for the G8 summit, we were with Secret Service and figuring it all out with Chief Lanier, and the technology they have is so amazing these days. We were testing technology for July 4th using, I forget what it's called. It's basically like heat sensors, and we were tracking traffic moving around the core. And one of the byproducts of this technology is that you could also you could sort of track particular types of movement. So we could actually tell when people were buying drugs, because the computer system, the overlay, would sense that people were walking up to a car and staying there for too long. And then, so the technology they have is absolutely amazing, and I don't know that we need more barriers. I think we need more technology, even though it freaks people out a little bit. The bottom line is we're all under surveillance all the time, so I don't think it's going to get any worse. A satellite can pick up a piece of dust on the ground. But I worry about too much hard infrastructure. There's a woman who was, I think, riding her bike during the G8 and stepped off the sidewalk and got backed over by a Humvee and killed. And that just sort of broke my heart, because I don't know that we needed the Humvee out there, with all the technology that we have.
So just lots of hidden surveillance and.
Yeah. It's
You put it like
everywhere.
that, I don't know.
We just need to utilize it
Yeah.
better. I mean, I think often what we do is we do that for public effect. Everyone remembers after 9/11, all the announcements on the metro, this orange alert, red, there was all this stuff that was really more propaganda. It's not really necessary. It's just, it makes people feel safer. So recognizing that's important.
Do we want to talk about the natural environment just for a bit? I mean, we have obviously a history of landscape architecture on the avenue going back to Jefferson, thoughts about tree planting, but we're also in an age of climate change where cities are going to have to respond to warmer temperatures, possibly flooding. Ellen, you very briefly mentioned this question of sustainability, but is that, given that that's a sort of worldwide challenge for the 21st century, is that something that should be brought back to Pennsylvania Avenue, and both for practical and symbolic reasons?
Absolutely. I think there's been extraordinary movements in green infrastructure. That's something that's very important to the Trust for Public Land, and New York is doing a lot to try to recapture stormwater and not, in a city that's dominated by CSOs and trying to clean up its water under a mandate. There's been so many innovative ways to do green infrastructure, and I think it would be terrific to do a demonstration project on Pennsylvania Avenue that took those concerns into effect, and that way both parties will have to admit that climate change is something that is actually happening. It exists, but it could do, and some of it is done with really beautiful rain gardens, really great ways to highlight design. So I think it's got to be part of the solution.
Yeah, I mean, if you had a park down the middle of Pennsylvania Avenue, I'm not trying to say that we should do that, but if you did, you could build in bioswales and rain gardens, and it could be gorgeous, and you could have tall, mature trees so that as it gets to be, 100 degrees in the summers here, you have more shade, which I think is important. I mean, one of the problems with how wide it is there is no shade, really, particularly when you're riding or walking down the middle of it. So, yeah, I think that's a concern.
And to take it back to Ellen's point about what do you do about the once every 4-year inaugural parade? Would something like that interfere with the function that was absolutely so important to the planners in the 1960s, maybe less so to us now?
No.
I've been thinking about this term activation, because it does seem like it can mean so many things, that in some times it's people sort of sitting, enjoying a drink, listening to music, and other times you're talking about much more active people moving their bodies, whether it's ice skating or dancing, or someone said mini golf, yoga, right? And this is interesting to me because we're having this national debate about exercise and diet and all the rest. is there, I mean, I don't see, again, in the histories of the 60s and 70s, I mean, no one was talking about bicycles then. Jogging was just coming in, but is this Fitbitization of America going to change the way we think about walking in general, but also somewhat more active forms of exercise? I'm not necessarily suggesting a climbing wall on the facades, but it could be cool. But you know, again, the skateboarders in some ways are potentially pioneers for what could be a more vigorous activation as opposed to the strolling and sipping kind of thing.
I think there's a place for it. You know, I don't think it has to be the dominant theme, and it doesn't have to be, you know, an effort to have that kind of activity happening, you know, 12 hours a day. But I think there are ways that we're using our public environment, our public realm, that show a lot more optimism than when I think about when I was in school at UVA in urban planning in the early 90s. You know, there's a respect and an engagement with the public environment that I think is so exciting right now. And so there's things to try, but I think you want to get people to go to Pennsylvania Avenue because they understand the grandeur, they understand the symbolism, they know that they can get some nice amenities as they're enjoying it. Maybe they want to see the museum, but it's got to be a link in that greater fabric. And it's got to have some clarity as to what it represents to people. But I think there's lots of things you can do without having a yoga class or a climbing wall and segways every 5 seconds. It doesn't have to be frenetic, but it can be enjoyable.
I may disagree with you a little bit. I mean, not that I think we should have climbing walls everywhere, but I do think that we should have a disproportionate amount of space, which we're close, for active transportation. I mean, active transportation is the future, really. You know, I think we've been walking ever since, we were Homo erectus, right? So, I mean, we need to walk. If we don't, we become sedentary and we become overweight and health insurance costs go up and blah, 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 right? And what the real movement in cities, like we don't really have a transportation problem, we have a land use problem. And so, you know, getting cities to build mixed use developments is what's solving a lot of our problems. You know, yes, we've seen a huge decline in motor vehicle registrations in DC while we've seen the population spike. And I would love to attribute that to car sharing and all kinds of stuff that I've worked on. But the reality is, you know, people are moving in and they're moving to places where they don't need to drive. And so I think Pennsylvania Avenue should reflect that too. And, you know, people have read Jan Gehl's books and, you know, this is a place you want to see at human scale. You want to see it on foot, if possible.
Well, we are coming to a close here. I do want to reiterate some themes. I mean, Ellen, you said things to try, and that to me is sort of the main message I'm getting from you too, and also a very optimistic one, that rather than having the 1962 or 1964 vision of, you know, this is how it will be and let's spend 30 years building it and then see if it works, we're talking about a more Silicon Valley fail quickly approach of temporary installations that may become permanent. Times Square, you know, would be a good example of, you know, you put some benches out and it turns out people like them. And business goes up. Or if it doesn't work, then you move the chairs and you get a different color paint and try that. But this idea that we're going to have lots of smaller scale, temporary modular initiatives and then build by increments, frankly is quite foreign to the approach of 50 years ago, but it may well be what we need now. So I think you may have resolved my initial fear that big plans and little plans don't go together. In fact, maybe little plans can add up to big ones. So let me thank you both, Gabe and Ellen, for these very astute comments. Let me thank the audience for your attention and for your great questions. And we will, I believe, call it there. Thank you very much.
Hopefully I didn't say anything too obtuse, but you know, it's sort of easier to freak people out. Shake things up a little bit. I really wish you she finally looked at the program and didn't